think we'll go ahead and get started, and people can continue to join into today's program. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Meredith Lehman, and I'm the head of museum education at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum at Washington University in St. Louis. And before we get started, I want to first acknowledge that I'm speaking with you from St. Louis on the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, Missouri, and Alini Confederacy, and many other tribes who were unjustly removed. We recognize these communities as we live, work, study, and benefit from this occupied land. In September, we opened at the museum the Outwin American Portraiture Today, a major exhibition organized by the Smithsonian Institution's National Portrait Gallery. It features the finalists of the 5th Triennial Outwin Bouchever Portrait Competition. Every 3 years, artists living and working in the United States are invited to submit a recent portrait to a panel of experts chosen by the Portrait Gallery. In 2019, 46 works were selected from over 2,600 entries in a variety of media, including painting, drawing, sculpture, photography, time-based media, and performance art. I am very happy to be joined today by 2 finalists of the 2019 competition, artists David Antonio Cruz and Jess T. Dugan, along with Dr. Amber Johnson, Professor of Communication and Social Justice at St. Louis University, for today's In Conversation talk. I'll just move to see an installation shot of the works displayed in the Kemper's galleries. The In Conversation series is our live online talks with select artists from the Outwin exhibition, and they will continue throughout the run of the show. And in our chat, we will share with you a link to the events calendar, which includes information about upcoming talks with Outwin artists, as well as additional public programs. We'd also like to share with you an audio guide that was created to accompany the exhibition that is accessible both in the galleries and on your devices for those who are unable to visit in person. The audio guide features St. Louis community members' responses to an artwork of their choosing from the exhibition, reflecting the insights and interests of our community. Now I would like to formally introduce our speakers. Amber Johnson is a scholar, artist, and activist whose research and activism focuses on narratives of identity, resistance, and social justice in media, popular media, and everyday lived experiences. They are the founding director of the Justice Fleet, a mobile social justice museum that fosters healing through art, dialogue, and play. And I believe we're putting that link in the chat if you'd like to check out more about the Justice Fleet. They're also the co-founder of the Institute for Healing Justice and Equity, which explores the relationship between healing justice and equity. Johnson is also an award-winning professor in the Department of Communication and associate provost in the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement at St. Louis University. Thanks for joining us today, Amber. David Antonio Cruz is a multidisciplinary artist and a professor of practice in painting and drawing at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University. Cruz fuses painting and performance to explore the visibility and intersectionality of brown, Black, and queer bodies. Cruz earned a BFA in painting from Pratt Institute and an MFA from Yale University. He attended Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture and completed the AIM program at the Bronx Museum. He recently completed residencies at the LMCC Workspace and Project for Empty Spaces Social Impact. Cruz's work has been included in notable group exhibitions at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, El Museo del Barrio, Performa 13, and the Bronx Museum of Art. His fellowships and awards include the Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant, the Franklin Furness Fund Award, the Urban Artist Initiative Award, the Queer Mentorship Fellowship, and the Neubauer Faculty Fellowship at Tufts University. We're excited to welcome you, David Antonio. And Jess T. Dugan, last but not least, is an artist whose work explores issues of identity through photographic portraiture. Dugan's work has been widely exhibited and is in the permanent collection of more than 35 museums throughout the United States. Dugan's monographs include To Survive on the Shore, photographs and interviews with transgender and gender nonconforming older adults, and Every Breath We Drew. They are currently working on a new book with MAC to be published, or MACK, to be published in the spring of 2022. They are the recipient of a Pollock Krasner Foundation grant, an ICP Infinity Award, and were selected by the Obama White House as an LGBT Artist Champion of Change. They are represented by the Catherine Edelman Gallery in Chicago. And if you are in St. Louis, please visit their stunning exhibition, Currents 120, currently on view at the St. Louis Art Museum through, I believe, February 20th, 2022. And we can share a link to that exhibition in the chat as well. Additionally, I'd like to recognize the William T. Kemper Foundation for their generous support, which has made the presentation of this exciting and important exhibition possible at the Kemper Art Museum. And just one last technical note, our conversation will run for about an hour. We encourage you to participate by asking questions using the Q&A feature. This is located on most devices at the bottom of your screen. Please be aware that we are recording this event and your questions will be recorded as well. And we will share the recording of the program on our YouTube channel in about a week. We will answer as many questions as we can in the second half of the program. So thank you to our three speakers for being here today, and thank you to everyone who's joined the conversation. I'd now like to turn things over to Amber to kick it off.
Great, thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm super excited about this conversation. I know it's going to be awesome and juicy and just lively and colorful. So we're going to start off with each artist discussing their work at large, specifically what their portraits represent, why they created them, and how they relate to their larger artistic practice. So David, Antonio, would you like to begin?
Sure. Hello everyone. And so I'm going to start off with the piece that's at the exhibition. And so The Boys Don't Ever Play Nice is a portrait, a painting of a couple in New York, Hipper and June. Pretty much as a family of folks that I've known for a very long time. And I was really drawn to their love and the way they interact with each other. And so I did ask for them to pose for the piece. And so at the time I was working on a series called the Dirty Boy Girl series, which was a series where I was thinking and exploring sensuality, desire, the queer body, flipping the way that we think about gender and love within the queer community, but also looking at art and the history of portraiture and trying to subvert that. And so in the piece, their bodies are intertwined, and touch is something that's really important in the work. And I constantly think about how we embrace and hold each other. And so also how bodies blend and become one. And so in this piece, having April be intertwined with June, especially at the legs, becomes a sense of support. And I wanted to create this image where the two would be interlocked and one becomes the other. And so there's this moment where the one is sliding, but that support system is the intertwining of the two. And so, yeah, so this has been part of my practice for a long time, just bringing people in and just really thinking about brownness, blackness, queerness in my work.
Thank you, thank you. Jess, tell us about your portrait in the show.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Before I jump in, I just want to say thank you so much to the Kemper and to Amber and David Antonio. I'm super excited. I like that you used the word juicy for our conversation. I think we have a lot to talk about and I'm really excited to jump in. And thanks also to the Portrait Gallery. I see we have a couple folks from there here today, so hello. Sure, so this is my portrait in the Outwin, and my practice as a whole focuses on photographic portraiture. I look at issues of identity, and in particular, I'm really interested in gender and sexuality and desire and connection. So this portrait is from a long-term project called Every Breath We Drew that looks at the intersection between individual identity and the need for connection with others. So it's very subjective. The people that I choose to photograph are people who I'm drawn to on a personal level, a visceral level, thinking about queerness, which I know we'll get into in more depth in a little bit. this particular couple is local here to St. Louis, Jamie and Anne. And Jamie in the front had breast cancer. And as you can see in this portrait, had had one breast removed. And she knew that she was going to go back and have a second surgery. And so she actually reached out to me to ask if I would document her and photograph her through this process. And we ended up working together over a period of years, which is something that I do in my practice. I like to work with the same subjects over a period of time. And so I photographed her with her partner, Anne. And, I was thinking about a couple things in this image. I was thinking about gesture and touch and holding, which I know we're going to talk about even more as we go along, but thinking about how we read intimacy and relationships through these physical acts. I was thinking about kind of Anne in the background as the support for what Jamie had gone through and kind of how they're holding each other. And then I was thinking about queerness in the landscape and photographing outside. I made this picture at a moment in my practice where I was starting to work more outdoors. And I did that in part because I love this quality of light. This was made very late in the day at sunset. The light was quickly shifting, and it really requires me to be responsive. And I love that as a photographer, but also thinking about queerness in the landscape, which again, I know we'll expand upon later. So I'm gonna pause there for my original initial introduction.
Wonderful. So first, congratulations to both of you. Both of these works are incredible for so many different reasons, the warmth, the richness, the textures, and you can feel the human emotions just laced throughout them. So congratulations on your accomplishments. So let's dig into your work. I would love for both of you to talk about your relationship to portraiture and what inspired you to begin your practice, how you maintain your practice, and then what your chosen mediums offer.
It's interesting because I for a long time, I go back and forth between the word portrait or not. And so I'm constantly thinking about that. And I just always think of painting people in a sense. And painting people has been such a huge part of my practice. I've always been drawn to just our gestures, the way that we stand, the way, how much of it talks about time and who we are, and it's a way to explore our lives. And so just thinking and seeing ourselves and being. And so that's always been something that I've been drawn to really early on, this idea of how to find oneself, how to see ourselves, how to reflect ourselves. And so painting the body has been such a huge part of that for me. And early on, this is actually a portrait of me performing in one of my costume pieces. And so I started thinking of using my body as a way to talk about masculinity, the community, understanding who I was, growing up in Philadelphia in pretty much a Black and Latino neighborhood, two parents who had moved from the island, from Puerto Rico, and navigating, understanding that line between two cultures and then complicating it with queerness and trying to understand my body, this idea, the projections that were, this idea of what is masculinity, what is Latino-ness, what it is to be a man, those roles. And for me, art allowed me to start to think about those things and exploring my body, who I thought I was, playing with things that were constantly being projected on me through society and also through my family, and then try to subvert those things. Actually, I think at times I was so uncomfortable with those gestures, but it was the hardest work at the time, but it was just really trying to understand my space, understanding who I was. And I think about it all the time as I make work. It's like, who am I? Where do I fit in? Where in our community, how we express ourselves, our sensuality, our sexuality, desire, our pain, the way society sees us. And now the way that we think about love and comfort, and as and it is constantly just constantly evolving the way that I think about the body and portraiture and people and work and painting. I mean, I'm obsessed with painting, and I have I always go back and forth with having this love-hate relationship with painting. And I feel like a lot of it, performance in a sense. It's allowed me to fall in love again with painting. They're different voices. They speak differently. They behave differently in the work. The voice changes. Growing up in a place where I was very quiet early on and very uncomfortable trying to find myself in. And so making work that I think is very loud, very present, very visible, very obnoxious, very unapologetic. Performance allows for that, especially in also in painting. But paint for me, there's such a rich history, problematic at times, but really beautiful, history of image making throughout time. And every time the idea of paint, when you pair it up with something else, the mixing, the thickness, the lightness, the transparency of it, constantly, it's a way to talk about time and space and future. And so, I love the material. I'm obsessed. I don't say I love painting. It allows me to just think about a magical space. It's not quite, although I think that people think of my work as being realistic, I don't ever think about it in that way, because to me it is a constructed space, a space of the future, a space for us to be, and it just doesn't quite sit right now, exists. And so I think of my work that way, and it that longing for that space and that home, it keeps me going all the time.
Yes, thank you for that. That idea of future, what a beautiful idea. I just want to sit with that for a sec, right? Painting this future that we already exist in, right? And what
Yeah,
to catch
yeah.
up.
I mean, the fact is that we go back and we constantly look at history and look at painting, and we just the wonder of who someone is, and it is such a documentation of a history. It doesn't matter how it's represented. It just speaks of a time, and so that's everlasting. And the fact of creating a mark of us as queer people, and owning that space, whether people want to address or not, it's here. It's there.
Yes. Jess, tell me about your relationship to portraiture and your inspiration maintenance and what your chosen medium offers.
Yeah, of course, David Antonio, I love so many things you said, and it's really fun to be in dialogue with a painter and to see how much overlap we have. So I feel like I'm about to say some of the same things, but for me, I was really drawn to photography from the very beginning, from when I was a teenager, and I just was drawn on this visceral level to make photographs and to make portraits. I had tried other media and enjoyed it, but once I found photography, I really hit my lane and was obsessed. Yeah, totally obsessed. I've been tunnel vision on photography for, almost 20 years. And for me, photography has always been a way for me to understand myself and my place in the world and my community. It's the way I process my life. I learn about myself through my work. And it's also my vehicle for intimacy and connection with other people. And I'm really interested in thinking about intimacy within queer communities. That's a huge part of my work. And I often joke that if I said to someone, could I come to your house and stare at you intensely for an hour? They would say no. It's like, it's not something that we agreed to. But when I say, can I make your portrait? That's what I do. And so my practice allows me to get to this space of intimacy and connection with other people that I find it really difficult to do otherwise. Or I should say, photography allows me to carve out that space where we're being intentional about making that happen. And I really am fueled by that. I'm an obsessive maker. So the question about kind of maintaining practice, I photograph, I don't take my camera with me everywhere, because for me, the act of looking and photographing takes intense focus and it wears me out. So I couldn't do that all the time, but I have to do it regularly. If I don't make pictures, I get real antsy, and it's the way I function in the world. So for me, it's a really important part of my life. And then I also think a lot about ideas of representation, and kind of to what David Antonio was saying about seeing ourselves represented. And I had very early and powerful experiences with seeing queer people in photography, and it was much more limited at that time. And I really believe in photography and representation more broadly as a really significant vehicle for validating identity, for serving as possibility models, for educating, for activism and education, for social justice. So those are the things I think about a lot in my work, and I work a lot with museums, in part because I believe really deeply in having this kind of work in the museum space. And then I also position some work outside of the museum space for different reasons. So this is a installation view of work from Every Breath We Drew, which includes the Jamie and Ann piece. And then if you go to the next slide, Meredith, so Every Breath We Drew is a long-term project. I'm 10 years in. And then this is a second project I did from 2013 to 2018 called To Survive on This Shore. And this series paired interview texts with portraits of people who were transgender and gender expansive and over the age of 50. So this piece had a really direct, storytelling component, educational component, activist component. So that is also a very significant part of my work.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm actually going to stick with you, Jess, because this goes right into our next question. And okay. I do want to remind our audience that the Q&A is open the entire time. So if you have questions, please pop them in there. And if they resonate with what we're talking about, I'll go ahead and throw them into the conversation. So please don't be shy. Use the Q&A, talk to us. So Jess, how you mentioned this idea of art opening up space for social justice and change, right? Creating representation. How does art and or portraiture pave a way for that change that other forms of expression may not allow for?
That's a great question. I mean, I think for me, photography, I guess we could talk about portraiture more broadly, but I'll just talk about photography for a second. I think photography slows down a moment and it creates a space where a viewer is really invited to look and to study and to experience. And, particularly in a project like this, where I'm working within a trans community, presumably a lot of viewers may be either unfamiliar, at best, or uncomfortable, or, discriminatory at worst. It allows them a chance to really slow down and engage and do a deep look and learn and read. And so for me, there's something really powerful about engaging with another person. And of course, a portrait is a stand-in, but it's a very powerful stand-in. And I think that storytelling is incredibly powerful. I think it's really hard to discriminate against a group of people once you've come to know someone personally and once you've come to understand them. So that's part of what I was trying to do in this work, was to sort of open that door and share the stories of the participants in a way that was validating for a trans or queer audience and educational for a non-trans or non-queer audience, and have the work exist in both of those spaces.
Yes, snaps to that. So David Antonio, I welcome you to answer that question, or if you want to continue with the next question, because I feel like this question is so deeply it's deeply seeped in your work around power dynamics, right? So do you want to talk about social change, or do you want to dig into that power?
I can say, I 100% agree with Jess, this idea of that pausing, that moment to allow a viewer to reflect and think about it. We have this relationship with moving images, and we kind of we process them very quickly, but it takes time for someone to really understand what they're looking at. And art in itself, it calls for you to stop, pause, and examine what you're looking at, how you're processing that, your relationship to the image, what you're looking at. And then, I hope that the work will haunt you. And I love the word haunt, because I want it to stay with you, for you to negotiate your relationship to it and how you see yourself. I think of the work as not being passive in a sense. I hope that that dynamics, you're always implied in the work. So as you look at it, the hopes is that you see yourself and find yourself in it. And so that is the power of when creating work and talking about certain issues that really affect our community and our community.
Beautiful. And it's so vivid in both of your bodies of work. It is such a vivid interpretation, that piece you speak to. So talk to me about power dynamics in portraiture. So how do you approach the relationship between artist, sitter, performance, portrait, and just what those power dynamics mean for how you move through the world as an artist?
This is one that I think that we think about now is something that we really, really are thinking about a lot. I think that the relationship of sitter and artist has evolved, has changed. Those relationships have changed quite a bit, especially when dealing with like a community that is considered marginalized or talked about and such, how important it is to be sensitive to the sitter. And so I don't, it's strange. I never think of them as sitters because like to sit for me, like you don't sit for me ever because it becomes a place of joy and play and exploration. Can you switch image? And dress up, fashion and celebration. And so for me, coming into my studio is one, I'm drawn to certain folks, like Jess was talking about the idea that there's something that brings you in that so it's really important. The folks that I pick in the community, I'm just really drawn by their energy and how they live their life or who they are or the ideas of what I think queerness is or breaking those social norms in whatever possible way that it could. I mean, I'm drawn to those folks. And so bringing folks in and, I'm always so thankful that folks allow me to do what I do. Like I couldn't do the work that I do if people didn't agree and believed in the mission or the work that I, want to do. And so I constantly talk about why I do what I do, why I think is important for us to represent ourselves or talk about ourselves in a way. And, and it goes on for that. And I constantly thinking about what is comfort, what is safe, what it feels safe for someone to be in your space and dress up. And I don't ever ask anyone to do anything that I would not be willing to do. And I'm constantly questioning, are you okay? Does this feel fine? And so, because it is a dialogue, and you want someone to see themselves in hopes that when they, can you switch image? They see themselves differently, understand themselves differently, as well as I am. And like so much of it is definitely a performance, and so much of that deals with like ideas of trust within that, and so it is very special. Every time, especially right now, the body work that I'm working on, it is so delicate. And so it's a gift. And I always think of it as a gift because like, I think of it as like a collection, this world that's being composed that might not be seen or wasn't talked about and creating that place for them. And I'm the lucky one. I'm lucky that way.
That's beautiful. Jess, how about you? Talk to me about power dynamics in your portrait work.
Yeah, Meredith, could we go back to that picture of Colin in the red room? I love so many things you said, David Antonio. I feel I already knew this, but I'm just intensely struck by how we operate under a similar set of ethics, which is interesting thinking about coming at it from photography and painting. I think for me, taking a step back, the way that I work is very slow and intentional. I work really collaboratively with my subjects. Obviously, I mentioned the choice of them is very specific, but I spend a lot of time talking to them about what kind of pose feels comfortable to you, what location is meaningful to you, how does this feel? Here's what I'm interested in. These are the ideas I'm thinking about. So I'm very communicative when working. My process of working is incredibly collaborative. If the participants or subjects or whatever word you want to use weren't really there in that emotional space with me and weren't giving something of themselves to me, my work wouldn't happen. So it really hinges upon this collaboration. And like David Antonio said, I'm always grateful for someone being willing to go there with me, both literally and emotionally. So that's a big part of my practice. And then I think a lot about power dynamics in photography, which of course are incredibly fraught. The history of the medium is very problematic and the power is always weighted toward the maker and toward the photographer, in my opinion, even when you try to mitigate it. So that's something I'm constantly thinking about. I'm questioning my own motivations for making work. I'm thinking about all of the intersectional identities that come into play into my work. A couple of things I do to try to balance that a little bit more, which you can see here, is I often allow my viewer to, I allow my subject to gaze directly at the camera, and then of course by extension me and the viewer. And I do this for a couple of reasons. One is that it really allows them to actively present themselves as they want to be seen, and of course they're still being seen by me, and that that's very subjective and ultimately is my vision, but it allows them to be really active in that moment. And then it also really activates the experience for the viewer. I love how you were talking about your paintings not being passive, and I feel the same way about my photographs. I want a viewer to be in this relationship, in this moment with this person. And by extension, I want them to think about how they're feeling, what kind of assumptions they have, how they relate to this person, what they're assuming about their identity. So I want the process of looking to be very active. And then Meredith, if you could go to the next one. And then the other thing I think about a lot is the idea of working within or outside of a community and how you approach subjects from that place. So I definitely push back against any assumptions that the queer community or the trans community is monolithic, because it's not. It's incredibly diverse in so many ways. But I do think there is a way in which making work about queer or trans identity from inside of that space, from inside of that community, changes the work and changes the trust and changes the comfort level. So that's another thing I think about a lot when thinking about power dynamics is whether I'm, of a similar identity or a different identity, or what kind of ways that we're the same, what kind of ways that we're different, and how that looks.
Yeah, that whole idea of being present and looking, and I love you mentioned that, Jess, because like when I have someone come in, it's just like, please always fix your eyes on me, because that is the portal. That will be the way that vision yourself is translated through the work to the viewer, and be present on all of it. Like, don't release yourself into it. Allow yourself to completely command your space, your body in the piece. So it's so important.
Yeah, I love that too. And it makes me think of, this is my own experience as a queer person, but I think the act of being seen by another person is so intensely and intimately tied to a validation of an identity that is not reflected in the mainstream. And so I think this idea of seeing and being seen takes on this added level of significance.
Yes. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, because I think this question really speaks to what you're both talking about in terms of your work being generative. So can you both talk about queer identity as well as cultural and racial identity as a generative force in your work? David, you're already off mute. So would you like to go first, David Antonio?
Sure. Let's go down to the painting of my mother and me, Meredith. I love this piece. It's just the last painting I did of my mother and me before she passed. But it is a force at the core. That intersectionality of those things of race, class, queerness are at the core of the work. It is how I think of the body of work, how, it's the way to see oneself and, the multiple possibilities, the way of interacting or seeing ourselves through others, but also through our own eyes. And so it is constantly something that I'm looking at and thinking about. Meredith, can we move on to the next slide? And then there's the aspects of coding and codes and language that I love, in history, that we're constantly history constantly pushes it aside, and you kind of have to go digging for it and bring it back up and remind that we've had a place. But I love the idea of language as ways of thinking and talking about queerness and race. And so fabric, clothing, symbols in the work is something that I'm constantly thinking about, almost creating a way of describing and talking about a body, but it's also owning some of the history and the violence that's been used in the words. So I'm constantly playing around with language, especially just between Spanish and English, the translations of it, and how we identify queer folks culturally and how to play with those words. And those become coded symbols in clothing. Here, I mean, I love this piece. I mean, this was one of the hardest pieces to work on, but this is an image of me queering my grandfather, how to be that, projecting this idea of masculinity. And so taking on clothing from the Caribbean, things that are seen as romanticized as like this ideal male or historically way of thinking about jibaros, machos, and taking that on. And so there's always a new way of thinking about it and how we find our place in it. And it's constantly generating ideas. It's constantly thinking about how much you want to talk about it, how much you want to expose, how do you want to talk about it, and who the audience is and how, how they receive that part of it. And it's impossible to divorce it from the work. It is the work, and it's the little sprinkles of each aspect and how they affect and change the way that your bodies are read, because we're not one thing, we're multiple things, and that, to me, it's just like thinking about the work in that way, how to bring in those things in and how that generates new subjects. And I use it a lot in performance, especially through play, through songs, using underground like music from Black, brown communities that in performing it and knowing that part of the audience will get it and understand and celebrate that moment, to switching words from English to Spanish to talk about queerness and really about language. One of the things that I love, one of my pieces from one of performance, which I love, and it goes to the core of it, is like we play Duck Duck Goose. And everyone understands what that is, but the second that you switch the words to Spanish, it talks about the word itself. Duck represents something else, and it's kind of owning this other space and subverting all that language and look in the way that we think of our bodies and how others perceive us and who they think we are.
Yes, so, yes, thank you for that. Jess, talk to me about how queer identity, cultural and racial identity are generative forces in your work.
Yeah, of course. Meredith, could we go to, I think it's the self-portrait. Perfect. Yeah. So for me, I think about these things differently in different bodies of work. I would say my work as a whole comes from my own identity and is heavily informed by that. So there is always that framework for where the work comes from. But in a project like To Survive on This Shore, which was more outward looking, was more documentary, I was, thinking about including participants based on a diversity of identities. So I was intentionally seeking diversity around race and ethnicity, gender identity and expression, age, socioeconomic status, geographic location, life narrative. So that process of finding participants for the project was a bit different than in a project like Every Breath We Drew. However, I was very aware of wanting that to be diverse, wanting that to be intersectional, wanting that to be complicated. And that was a really important part of that project. In Every Breath We Drew, it's much more personal, it's much more subjective. There's not a documentary element in the same way, even though I'm often working within queer communities. It's, very much about me and my desires and who I'm drawn to and what kind of emotional space we can create together. So some of these things still come up, but it comes from a different place. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because when people write about my work, they often reduce it. They'll often say, Dugan photographs all trans people or all queer people. And that's not true for me. And I've been really teasing out how to articulate that in my more personal work. It's made within a framework of queerness. It's made from a queer gaze, but I don't want to pinpoint identities of the subjects or participants. And I think it's not even possible. It's like, what does that mean? Like that you're photographing people with a shared identity. We're so diverse and different in so many ways. So I think I have different bodies of work. Some I'm more identity focused and I'm thinking about a certain kind of education, and others are really personal. But I've been reframing that. Like my work is made from my queer gaze, but it doesn't always reflect anything specific about the identity of the person you're looking at.
Both of you are super intentional about setting place, landscape, surroundings. You've mentioned it multiple times. And there's also a question in the chat about this. So I figured we should go there next. So can you talk about the importance of place in your work? Jess, if you want to start, you're welcome.
Oh, sure. Yeah, Meredith, can you go to, we can come back to this set here in a minute. Could you go to, yes, this one, perfect. So for me, you know, I often try to photograph in quiet spaces, private spaces. A lot of my earlier work was in people's homes or bedrooms or kind of intimate spaces. And I'm always really interested, whenever possible, I like to make the work in a place that has meaning to the person and reflects something about them. You know, increasingly I've been working outdoors, and that was a shift that was happening in my work prior to the pandemic, but then became the way that I worked exclusively during the pandemic. And so I'm thinking about different things. You know, living in Missouri has affected me, living in St. Louis, in a way that I honestly found a little bit surprising. And one of those ways was the landscape coming in. So I'm thinking about you know, queer bodies in a natural space, queer bodies in an open space, as opposed to being in an interior space. I'm thinking about how that reads differently. If you could go to the next slide, Meredith. So, and that last one, I guess I should have said we don't have to go back, but you know, that was a small town in Missouri where that person grew up, and so there was this really important meaning to that place. And then in an image like this was made in Tower Grove Park, which is near where I live, and I spend a lot of time there walking, and because I'm so up close and personal, I'm looking at little things like changes in the trees, changes in the light. And so this is a space where I've made a lot of work here in St. Louis. So also thinking about my relationship to a landscape and my relationship to a place. So yeah, maybe I'll pause there, but I like the spaces to be not always hyper specific, but to say something and add something to the image.
David Antonio, talk to me.
Can we go to the image of St. Croix? So I'm going to split it between performance and painting, because I think although the landscape and place operate differently, although I do think about history and I think about home, shelter constantly in the work, they just happen to operate very differently. In performance, for example, this is a piece from St. Croix, at the Wind Plantation Estate. And this is Green, which is a piece based on Garcia Lorca's last 11 poems, which are really queer in nature and very much about wanting and longing. And the pieces were vanished or disappeared or banned for about 50 years after his assassination. So it's really rooted in this idea of love and wanting to connect. And so a lot of the performances happen in different spaces. And for me, I constantly want to play with the history and think about the history as the pieces are being made. And so not to push in, but to actually surround and quote or live, exist in that history. Can you switch to the next image, Meredith? So, for example, this one is the St. Croix, and this is the Wind Plantation, which is the largest slave plantation, the buildings that are standing in St. Croix. And I had the opportunity to work in the Great House, or the Massive House. And for me, my crew, folks that I've been working on with about 8 years, have been collaborating in performance and music. Being people of color, to me, this is a really sensitive place, and having to deal and negotiate with the history of this space and the problematic aspects of it. And for me, dressing up, quoting the location, the people there, the silks rippled like water, the oceans, the auction block like pieces, and having to move through the space and really owning that space. And it was really important for us to address its history, be a part of it, alter it, show the things that were never talked about in that space, especially in this house that belonged to the Master and Sons. And so taking up the entire space and performing from room to room, carrying our voices and almost kind of like just pushing out his body out of the space and hoping to own that space through voices and history and language. And so I'm constantly thinking about those spaces and how they reflect and alter and change the voices in the performances. And the objects, the clothing change. Like, for example, in Puerto Rico, we dressed in white to talk about bomba, a celebration that white and how it's used throughout the Caribbean and West Africa, but the colors were gold and blue to talk about the orishas. And so I'm constantly thinking about space and how we fit in that space and how either how we're seen in that space, but how we're coding, and also honoring and thinking about ancestors. Can we switch over to the next image, Meredith? And that, thinking lately about vegetation has been something that I've been thinking a lot, especially as I've been working on this new project. And so the landscape is something that started to arrive in my work. And although in my paintings, they're completely fully constructed, people are invited into my studio or in other locations, but the whole world is completely fully constructed, from the couches to at times clothing. And it's almost like breathing a new world into these pieces. And for here, I wanted to really think about the landscape of where the people were that I was talking about. And so the vegetation in these pieces that operate almost as a ghost, a shadow, are part of the landscape where the bodies of the folks are. And so it's constantly something that I'm thinking about, how we engage with space, how the residue of it, of history of our time, of our bodies in the space.
We have so many good questions, both in the chat and more on this list to get to, and we don't have a whole lot of time left. So being cognizant of time, because I want to get it, because there's some really practical questions in the chat that I think would be helpful to a lot of people who are on the call. So I'm going to pick one more question. I'm going to merge two questions, and then we're going to jump into the chat. So I want to talk about futurity, right? So what does the world look like that is free from sexual, gender, ability, and racial oppression? Like, what does it look like? How does that show up in your work? And then can you connect that to intimacy? Because I know that's a part of the future I want to live in, right? And so how does it show up in your work, but also how does intimacy then reflect this future world that you are trying to sort of build?
That's a big question. I know we have like 4 topics to still get to. I was going to say, Meredith, could we go back just briefly to that self-portrait section of mine? And then I'll jump to the next set of images. We had talked about the ways in which our bodies show up in our work. And I think for me, this is part of how to answer that question about futurity and intimacy and queerness. But I just wanted to talk briefly on how I use my own body in my practice, and this has always been part of my practice from the very beginning. And I think for me, this is a way to like process my own life and make sense of that. But also, and maybe this is the part that answers this question more directly, I found that by sharing my own experience and sharing my own world, and making that world what I need it to be, free from constraints around gender and sexuality, it really opens a space for other people to share with me. And it makes it possible for me to build this kind of, I don't want to say queer utopia, that's not what I mean, but this space with others in my work. So Meredith, if you could go ahead. So this one was from 2014, and then I've sort of riffed on my own work in this newer portrait here. And then I guess let's jump ahead to the next set of images, if you don't mind, Meredith. I think it's after David Antonio's. But yeah, to go to this question of like touch and intimacy, I think, for me, one thing that's always been so magical about queerness is this idea of chosen family and chosen community and intentionality in the way that we live. And that's something that I think about in my work a lot. And I think about this idea of being part of an extended community and an extended queer family and kind of what that network means. We talked about this a little earlier too, but I think about this idea of how we validate each other's identity through touch and through seeing and through connection and through intimacy. And one thing, if we could go to the next image, one thing I think about a lot in my work is how we read things like, relationships and gender and desire and sexuality through touch and through gesture. We can go to the next slide. I think I have a couple more in here. Thinking about this idea of holding and claiming. In a lot of my work, I have one person holding another person. It's very common for me to have one subject looking out at the viewer and one looking away. And it's kind of this way for me to say, this is who I am. This is who I love. We're going to show that to you proudly. It's this kind of complicated dynamic. And then if we could go just to the next one. I think this is the last image in this section. But the other thing I was thinking about in this question is the idea of care in practicing and care in photographing and care in making work as an intentional strategy. And I think at least I've seen that come up more in queer practice than in some other spaces. And I think especially working within the photographic space, that's really important. So I think, I'm so touched by this conversation in a way and thinking about these ethics of how we make work. But I think centering care and centering like trust and centering consent and all of these things is really, really important, at least to me. And sounds like to David Antonio too.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. I mean, more than ever. I mean, not that it's ever been easy, but more than ever, care and love and comfort is so important and needed. And can we switch over slide? Yeah, that necessity to be held more than ever, to be loved when so much is out of our control, and constantly negotiating our existence, a place for us to be safe, to be okay. And so, because that's not the conversation that is always projected on us many times. It's not about those things. And so to talk about those things with us, because we know that joy, we know that love, we know that compassion, we know our family, the ones that hold us up. And we know what that is, but that is foreign to others. I think only recently is something that people are starting to understand. And because it's not that it's always been a part, the core of our community. It's just now those voices are being allowed to speak and talk about it. It's like, and it's so baffling, I think, for others to understand. What do you mean that that's your mother and your father and that's your brother and your sister? What does that mean? And and knowing that there's a troop and crew of people that love you for you. And it's not connected to anything else but your spirit and your heart. And so for me, touch and comfort has become really, 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 really important in my life. And how we see ourselves and talk about ourselves. And, this is a painting from 2006. So it's really, I love thinking about the work that I'm doing now. And you see all their hands, all their arms are all intertangled and intertwined, and the fingers. I mean, it's just this idea of like being held and being present. And I love just making that comment of like being touched or touch, this idea that validates my existence, understanding that I'm present. And I love that, this idea that it's another way of seeing ourselves and being seen. Can we switch over? And so the future, oh my God, the future. Because when we think about art, whatever we make, we talk about it's for today, and we hope for tomorrow, and we hope that tomorrow someone will look at it and say that we were present, that we were thinking about these things, that we were trying to connect, that we were trying to be one. And so, especially for this project, this Chosen Power, it's been that thing about how do we deconstruct the whole idea of like gender or norms, like how to sit properly, you know, how to behave when we're told this is what you need to be or seen or behave. And so can we switch over to the last one? But what comfort looks like, what does love look like, what does touch looks like? And so for me, the future, I mean, it will be safe.
Mm.
It would just be safe because like, and hopefully we wouldn't have to fight for our existence.
Mm.
Because that would be a given, and it doesn't matter, you know, the gender and love and all those other things wouldn't quite be the thing that we focus on, and we acknowledge that we exist in the same space and acknowledge that the value is equal, you know, because like I think it's the value thing. I think there's the thing about what is considered important and who isn't, and who gets a space, who gets a time, who gets to be heard, who gets to be loved, who gets to be taken care of.
Yes.
So I hope that's safe.
Yes. Okay, we have 4 minutes left. There are 2 questions. Our first 2 questions I'm going to pop in there. One is to Jess and one is to David Antonio. So as quickly as you can, Jess. Can you talk?
Okay.
We have 4 minutes. I wish we had another hour. Can you talk about the difference in conceiving art for a book versus an exhibition?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think in books in part because I'm a photographer. I think so many of us discovered photographs in books. But I also love exhibitions. So for me, when I'm making the work, I'm aware that it will be in both of those places. So I don't, the way I make the work is not so much affected by that. But I do think a lot about the difference between a book and an exhibition, and that affects the way I sequence, it affects my edit. You know, I think there's a lot of power in an exhibition space, but I also think there's an incredible intimacy in the book form. I actually, this wall behind me is my layout for a forthcoming book, and it has a lot of text, and it's really poetic and really subjective, and it's going to be this object unto itself. So I think they're just 2 very different media, but I don't privilege one over the other. I love the exhibition space and I love the book format.
Thank you. And David Antonio, Ida says, I love the titles of your work and I'm curious how you see them. Wait, where'd the question go? Meredith moved it. I think Ida says, I'm, wait, maybe it's an answer.
Yeah, it's an answer.
There we go. How do you see them relating to the paintings and where do they come from?
Oh my God, poetry. I love to write. It's funny, I never thought as a child that writing would become a part of my practice, especially, you know, learning English being a second language and was not spoken at home. But, and being such a quiet person, allowing visual language to be my language, and it still really is. But they come from my writing, from my performances, a lot of it. And at times people, I like to remove the space because I want to slow you down. I want when someone looks at it to have a moment to reflect. A lot of times they are not connected to the paintings. They work in a different way. They're about, you know, so there's a slowdown, but they really come out of my performance work, things that I'm constantly thinking, ways of reacting. And so, for example, the portrait of June and April, which is at the Kemper right now, The Boys Don't Ever Play Nice. It is just talking about my paintings being loud and somewhat obnoxious and not liking other things around it. And so a lot of it really comes with play, word play, and a lot of it comes from really personal memories. So a lot of the writing that comes from my performance is really personal and deals with just history. And so, for example, this one is on that summer night. It was just the first time that I met Anthony back when I was in my 20s. And I remember that night. And as I was working on this project, just thinking, reflecting in time. And so the title itself reflects and thinks just a little moment of that moment, how I felt at that time. But a lot of it is really, truly based on play and poetry. So, yeah.
We could legit talk about these things for hours, days, months. I want to thank both you, Jess T. Dugan, and you also, David Antonio Cruz, for sharing your work, your passion, and your lives in such intimate ways. And I want to thank our audience for these wonderful questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but there's some really great questions in the chat. So I will turn it back over to Meredith as we say thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. It's been a treat.
Thank you, everyone. And hope you enjoy the rest of your day as you carry on. And thank you especially to our speakers for really this conversation is quite a gift and leaves us with a lot to think about as we consider touch and intimacy and across all of our relationships. So thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. And I hope that I get to see all of you when I come to St. Louis, because my partner's from there, so I go there a lot. And this will be the first time I've been to St. Louis in like 2 years since, oh my God, a year and a half since the craziness began. And so I'm really hoping to meet all of you in person, have a drink or a coffee or something.
Yes. Please.
Yes.
I love that.
That would be wonderful to all get together.
It's been really, really a pleasure. And yeah, getting to know you, Amber, and Jess, I've known your work for a long time. And so this is really, it's been really wonderful and the synergy between our works and the way we think, I love.
Yeah.
Likewise. I feel the same. Also, we still have an audience in case you didn't know that.
We did.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, but let's keep it going for sure. We'll pick up this conversation.
I totally forgot that we have an audience.
Yeah.
Now, like, I
Yeah. All right.